Okay, this is Noah Smith and David Shor for afternoon tea. Got my rabbit mug, and I'm all ready to get shore pilled. Um, but first, David, where are you living and what are you doing right now?
I live in New York City. I'm originally from Miami, and I work for Open Labs. We do a lot of cool machine learning as applied to politics in terms of helping kind of elites in the Democratic Party figure out what to talk about, what ads to use, and also how close various races are. Um, we are hiring, so if anyone just wants to go to my Twitter and scroll, we have job postings up for software and machine learning engineers. So yeah, I just want to do that
Open
quick
Labs,
plug.
folks.
Thank
Help
you.
help elect the Democrats. Um, it's still pretty focused on Democrats, right?
We elect Democrats and we help progressive causes, climate, labor, all of that. But yeah, no, we're very ideological.
Got it. All right. Well, uh, first question is, um, I remember when everyone was really freaking out about Cambridge Analytica and this company, how Cambridge Analytica had swung the election to Trump, blah, blah, blah. Later, some analyses came out showing that Cambridge Analytica's ads on Facebook weren't that effective. How do you know how effective this kind of stuff is?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it gets to a very real problem in politics, which is that it's very hard. In politics, you don't observe your own conversions. There's no tracking pixels in people's brains yet, anyway.
Yeah.
And, one day, I'm sure Facebook, Amazon, I don't know, someone's working on it. And this creates a real problem, which is that there's a lot of ad tech tools out there to help figure out what to do. Where if you're Dollar Shave Club, you can put up a bunch of advertisements and have a tracking pixel on your landing page or on your sales page, and then just figure out what works. And it's really easy to just put things out there and see what does best. But the problem in politics is that the only people who engage with political content are highly engaged partisans. And particularly, the only people who engage with Democratic content are highly engaged liberal partisans. And what persuades them doesn't necessarily persuade people who are in the middle of the political spectrum. And just to give like an example of this, when we went back and tested, and I'll explain how we tested things later, but when we went back and tested the Mirrors ad by Hillary Clinton, it was the most talked about ad in the 2016 cycle. It was the most viewed. It was shared, I think, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of times, and tons of money was put behind showing it to people. When we went through and actually tried to test it, kind of doing a randomized controlled trial, and the logistics of this are kind of complicated, where some people see the survey, some people don't. You like go and you survey them later and you look at the difference. What we saw was that it actually cost votes. In the ad, just to describe it, there's like a little girl and she's looking in the mirror, and then Donald Trump is saying all of these really terrible things, sexist things, racist things, making fun of disabled people. And I think the girl cries, or I think there's multiple little girls. And it was like a very powerful ad for people like me and I guess like us. But working class white people reacted really badly to it. When you look at the open ends, of what people were saying in response to the ad, they were saying things like, Donald Trump is talking about real problems. He's talking about trade, he's talking about jobs, he's talking about immigration. And, this is just kind of educated liberals trying to guilt us into ignoring those things. And so people reacted badly. And that kind of just shows, the importance of testing things. We went through in 2018 and 2020, we've tested at this point thousands of advertisements, and something like 20% of advertisements that people put out make people more, that Democrats put out, make people more likely to want to vote for Republicans. And the other funny thing is, we did a small sample here, but the more people in the office like the ads, generally the worse they do. For the basic, and this is the core problem in politics. And what I see a lot of, my job and what I see like data science and and statistics in the job of politics is that the people who work in political campaigns are super weird. Democratic political campaigns. They're very educated. They live in cities. They're disproportionately white, and they're very young.
I'm sure Republican operatives are not particularly normal either.
100%. And to be clear, they're actually not, they're also not all white. I think a majority of the Republican operatives I've ever met have been non-white, actually. I'm sure it's not the real number. But yeah, no, Republican operatives are also very strange. And, I do think that creates an interest. I mean, just to take a quick tangent, it does create a real asymmetry, though, which is that like there's an asymmetry that comes from this, which is that people who run political parties and people who run, all institutions are all highly educated and disproportionately cosmopolitan, because that's just kind of how society works, for better or for worse.
You want
But
to get the folks out in the boondocks who are vote in massive numbers and who, yeah, maybe
yeah,
they're
no,
old, maybe they're didn't go to college, maybe, whatever.
in
Uh,
practice, they don't do a ton of project management,
right.
which is no, I mean it's a real problem. But the asymmetry here is that if you look, and there have been really great studies where they actually like look at like donors, or they look at elites, and they compare them to the overall to the rest of the party. Republican donors and also Republican staffers are more cosmopolitan than Republicans by a substantial margin, looking at issues like immigration or trade. And the same is true within the Democratic Party. But the difference is that that's relative to the party. And so this cosmopolitan bias for Republicans kind of pushes them toward the center, while for Democrats, it pushes them away from the center, which is, kind of the problem. But anyway, that was a random tangent. So, just going back, like these Democratic staffers are, very liberal, they're very
They're
young, and
weird.
this
Yeah.
they're very weird. And this manifests in a lot of ways. Like there was this great study, I think
It's
by
like when
Ryan.
when
Okay.
VCs say you are not market, right?
Yes,
You can't just think what product would I like, and that tells you what product the market will like. That's not how it works.
that is not how politics works.
And but
And
politics maybe even more, because they're, like everybody kind of likes somewhat similar, kind of like phones or something, or like
right.
click a button on an app, everyone kind of does it the same way. But like in politics, there's just massively radically different and disagreeing ideas, values, and all this stuff. So you're dealing with people who are weird and not like you, and trying to get these people who aren't like you to vote for your candidate. That's
Yeah,
a weird thing
it is a
you have to
very
do.
weird
I'm
thing,
using the word
and
weird to describe everything.
it's
I
a
just mean
helpful
high
place to start with.
variance. It's I just want to say high variance. All
That's
right,
right.
it's high variance.
But I want to give
Okay,
one
go.
quick example. I
Yeah.
want to just one quick example just to show the height of this, which is in 2012, these two political scientists, Enos and Eitan Hirsch, I think, they did this survey of Obama staffers, like campaign professionals who worked for the Obama campaign, and they asked questions like, what's the most important issue to you? And something like a third of them mentioned income inequality. And then they also sampled undecided voters, and literally, I think like 1% of undecided voters said that they cared about income inequality. That doesn't mean, maybe they support higher taxes on the rich, but like it just shows that people who work in politics have this whole ideological superstructure and set of values that regular people actually just don't have. And so when they're making content that represents these values or speaks to these values, and it just doesn't land, or in some cases is counterproductive, because to the audience that actually matters. And so I see the big role in what we try to do, as trying to help us kind of step outside of these biases, and be a little more in touch with what regular people care about.
Right. All right. So tell me this: why did Bernie Sanders lose the primary in
In
2020?
2020,
And why did I lose 6 dinners betting on Bernie Sanders to win the primary?
yeah, no, that's a great question, and I will preface it by saying that presidential primaries, are highly chaotic, multi-party events. There are a lot of worlds where Bernie Sanders won, and I think he had a substantial chance of winning. And
You mean in
also,
the
for record,
quantum sense, in the many worlds hypothesis sort of
yeah,
sense?
no,
There's many worlds.
yeah, no, I mean, in the many world sense, just because really, the primaries are actually kind of hard to predict, and so I do want to start with that. But you know, I think that there was I think there's a great analogy with both Bernie and with Jeremy Corbyn, where the first time they ran, they did a lot better than people were expecting, and I think they did that by showing a lot of messaging discipline and a lot of ideological discipline. They like Corbyn. He campaigned with cop unions on hiring more police officers. He talked. He was talking about healthcare. In the same way with Bernie Sanders, he avoided a lot of toxic policy specifics, including on stuff like Medicare for all, and really just kind of focused on this, broad message of, lowering, making the country more fair, taking on the billionaires, giving people health care. And, that's something, yeah, big fan. And for what it's worth, I voted for Bernie twice. But I think that there's a big market, and
I only
something
vote in Republican primaries, by the way.
Oh, good. Well, it's not,
I
if more liberal, if liberals only voted in the Republican primary, maybe that would accomplish something. But yeah, entryism by any other name. But I see I see the failure. Like if you want to, like I think Bernie he had a platform that really appealed to kind of low trust voters. Like if you look at the polling of who were the people who he, like when you look at Bernie versus Trump versus Hillary versus Trump, he really outperformed among kind of working class white people. If you look at social trust, it was a big predictor. And I think that he really had this worldview that really kind of appeals, to kind of this low trust society, promising easy solutions to hard problems. And I think that's great. That's the future of American politics. So like it or not. But it doesn't appeal. It's just funny. Social trust, it's been declining for decades. The only group now of high social trust voters left in the country is really Democratic primary voters. Something that's just really important. And this is honestly how you should start any discussion about why Bernie Sanders lost, is that the median Democratic primary voter is 58 years old. In the New Hampshire Democratic primary, something like 15 to 20% of voters were under the age of 45. And so if you build a campaign, no, it's a real fact. Like really, primary voters are super, super old, and public polls don't capture this. But when you actually look at administrative, because they're based on self-reported vote likelihood, but when you look at administrative vote history, it really just comes through. Like presidential primary voters are really substantially older, than people realize. And so that means that if you build a coalition built on, millennial and Zoomer identity politics, it's going to be really, combined with like, a kind of low trust, like messaging, it's going to be really hard to win. And so I think that's, the big picture for why that happened is that if you look at who he did best among, it was young people, it was less educated people, it was poorer people, and those people it was low trust people, and those people don't vote in Democratic primaries. And that's just like a very hard thing to overcome. But I think the other point is I think that, they started with an enormous amount of ideological discipline. And that's why his base in the 2016 primary was working class white people. That was the only group that voted for him, in relative terms, other than young people in 2016. And that's why he was able to win places like Michigan and all this other stuff. But then
was
in the
that
2020,
was that similar to the way that Trump captured those voters in that election cycle? Or was it just a very different reason?
No, I think it's for similar reasons, right? Like,
Trump activated racism. I'm not sure that Bernie Sanders activated racism.
I think it's true. I wouldn't say that Bernie Sanders activated racism, yeah, but I do think the broader trying to present yourself as an anti-system candidate in like a reasonable way is something that works. And I also think, a big part of Donald Trump winning, I think, racism was a really big part of it, was that he really tapped to economic moderation. I think it's like one of the most underrated things about the 2016 election is that voters thought they ranked Trump as substantially more moderate than Clinton. And actually, if you look at the ANES ratings, and actually he's rated as one of the most moderate people to ever run for president. And he did that by saying, I'm not going to cut Social Security. I'm not going to cut Medicare. And I think that Bernie Sanders, obviously he wasn't tapped into the center, but he was actually really tailoring his views, I think, maybe accidentally, to working class white people, in that he was really avoiding talking about immigration. He was avoiding talking about reproductive choice. He was, every sentence he could, pivoting to this broad message of trying to make it easier to get healthcare and tax the rich. And like, yeah, I think that is something,
And then what happened in 2020 then?
In 2020, I think that there was a real, I think that for a couple of reasons, they came out of the 2016 election, thinking that the reason why they lost was that they didn't have a broad enough coalition. They didn't appeal enough to, racial justice activists or other kinds of activists. And I also think that just mechanically, a bunch of left-wing people got very excited by Bernie Sanders and then joined his campaign. So
Young fired up. So he began as sort of a centrist, populist, white working class focused insurgent candidate. a bunch of lefty kids got enamored of him, joined his campaign, and turned it into like what, woke, super woke? I mean,
I mean, I think there's wokeness. I think there's just, it became a much more left-wing campaign. And I think there's just, one example I
mm,
like is that a lot of his campaign posters in 2016 said, paid for by the people, not millionaires and billionaires. And then in 2020, a lot of his campaign posters instead said solidarity forever. And like, I think you can build a coalition around broad redistributive politics, but it's a lot harder to build a coalition around, Pete Seeger cosplay. And I think that was like a big kind of strategic error that they ended up making.
I like Pete Seeger.
I also like Pete Seeger. Well, it's one of my best, I guess, childhood memories. I was like 16. I was at the Obama 2008 inauguration, and Pete Seeger was performing, and he did all the verses to "This Land Is Your Land," and I was just like, oh wow, the Democrats, they're calling to abolish private property. The next 4 years are going to be amazing. And
I'm not for abolishing private property, but I am for abolishing private land property. I'm a Georgist.
yeah, yeah, no, I mean,
So
me too.
you can have private property if it's like something that's actually created and made. That's my radical position, Georgism. Um,
George did nothing wrong. Yeah,
George is
100%.
nothing. Otherwise, no one owns the land. Anyway, so that aside, okay, so that was what happened with Bernie Sanders. So in 2020, uh, I wrote about politics, which I know is dumb because I'm not a politics I didn't go to grad school for that. I'm not a specialist. Um, I feel like it's uncertain enough where it's one of those things where if you're just like a slightly self-confident like white dude who just like opines on shit, that you can sort of get away with writing about it, but that's seductive because like you still don't know anything. So I fell into that trap though, and I wrote about politics, and I wrote about the 2020 election, and basically the Hispanic shift to Trump. So Trump lost a bunch of white voters in especially in suburbs. Um, Racial polarization in that sense went down a little. Black voters maybe shifted a tiny bit toward Trump, but still basically were like, no, screw that. Um, but Hispanic voters, there was a shift, and I looked at a number of data sources, and I also like the one person in like Trump land or the Republican political, whatever, that I know is actually a guy who worked on Trump's Latino outreach effort, and so he sent some data, and then and basically it looks like this shift was real. It wasn't like a huge shift, it wasn't like a stampede, but it was real, and it wasn't really super concentrated among like Cubans in Miami or just like Texas border counties, although maybe that was a bit more. But like really it was in most places in the nation, and most sort of ethnic groups of Hispanics, you saw this shift. Is that true? Am I right about this? Did I do my homework correctly? And also, why?
These are great questions. And I'm going to just preface up front by saying that when it comes to understanding why the why question, I'm going to be honest that I don't know, but I have opinions, and I'll say things. I don't have as much confidence as other
Sure,
things.
sure, sure.
So when it comes to the Hispanic vote, it's a little hard because polling didn't really see the full extent of this coming. And so my team has been doing a lot of ecological regression and combining that with polling to just kind of
For the
look
kids in the
kind
back,
of
can you explain what that is?
yeah, ecological
Ecological regression.
regression is just yeah, you look at precinct level election results, and you look at the characteristics of those precincts, and you use that to try to infer how these groups voted. So if you see that we really underpredicted our polling in like in very Hispanic precincts, that tells you that probably there was a decline among Hispanic voters relative to polling. So we've been doing a lot of this work, and anyone who does this stuff professionally will attest that it's actually very hard. There's like a lot of statistical problems. In fact, people often talk about the ecological fallacy that comes from this sort of thing. But that said, I feel fairly confident in saying that there was a large substantial decrease in the Hispanic vote. I'd say if I had to put a number on it, I would say it was probably 8 or 9% in percentage points, and
Hmm.
so nearly 20 points in margin. There's some variation. There was a lot larger in Florida, not just with Cubans, but with Puerto Ricans in Osceola County, and for reasons that are not super clear. And then there were the other piece is that the largest decline, people talk about Cubans, but the actual largest decline was in areas with large Latin American populations, so Colombians and Venezuelans. There's actually one precinct that is within walking distance to my deal where I went to school in Florida and FIU, basically the Doral area, where there was one precinct where I think Hillary Clinton won by something like 40 points and Donald Trump won by 10. So there were very large declines, among these groups from like Colombia and Venezuela and likely elsewhere in Latin America. But even outside of that, there was basically a pretty broad decline and almost a uniform decline in a lot of ways, in places like Nevada or New York or California, once you properly do the regressions. So that's the descriptive statistic. In terms of why this happened, we've done some post-election surveys, and I think the first thing, which the first descriptive statistic I'd say, is that historically, non-white voters are substantially more conservative. Non-white Democrats are or people who vote for Democrats are
And when you
substantially
say
more
conservative, you mean in the old cultural conservative sense of like going to church and believing in traditional gender roles and blah, 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 and not in the sense of the conservative movement of America, which is probably more race focused.
So I would say that if you literally ask people, do you consider yourself to be liberal, moderate, or conservative?
Okay, just
You know,
self-identification.
just self, I mean, it's true in other, if you look at issues, if you look at views on homosexuality, views on crime, even to be honest, views on race, we're now at the point, and this has only been true really since the Great Awakening in 2014, generally speaking, non-white Democrats are now more conservative, even on racial issues, than white Democrats, which is crazy, or at least than white liberals, which is wild. But when it comes to other issues, like social issues or even economics, the reality is that a lot of non-white voters identify as conservatives, have conservative beliefs, but still voted for Democrats, otherwise. And the story of 2020 at a high level is that that's starting to change. And what I mean just literally is the correlation between self-reported ideology and how people vote went up in 2020 among Hispanics relative to 2016. And what that means, mostly is that you had this large block of Hispanics who consider themselves to be conservative, who started voting for Trump in higher numbers, and that gets the bulk of that. And that still leaves the question of okay, why did that happen?
Well, first, before you go into why, actually, I want to interject one question here. If that self-identified conservatives among like non-white people who were voting for Democrats, if they shift Republican, what's the ceiling on the percent of Hispanic votes, on the percent of Black votes? Although I don't know if this, or Asian votes, I don't know. What is the ceiling on these percentages that the Republicans could get? Like, could they get 40% of Hispanics? Could they get 44%? Like, what are we looking at here?
So, you're asking.
Scare me.
Well, so I'm not going to answer the direct question of what is their vote share ceiling. But what I will say is that something that's kind of crazy about self-reported ideology is that if you cross-tab it by race, not even restricting to Democrats, Black people have roughly the same ideological breakdown as white people. They're roughly as likely to identify as liberal or moderate or conservative. And I believe that's true for Hispanic voters as well. And so if things perfectly polarized by ideology, then non-white voters would vote like white voters. And we would get, that means that they would get 60% of the vote. Now, I'm not claiming that that's likely or that's going to happen. Obviously, it's a lot of historical and other factors.
But if Republicans could find some way to be less racist and activate more race neutral conservatism, there would be huge opportunities for them to win a bunch of votes from blocks that now vote pretty solidly against them. Is that the idea here?
I would modify that slightly, since it turns out that there actually are for a lot of a large number, and I'll get to this in a second, of non-white voters, particularly Hispanic voters, who have racially conservative views. But what I would say is that, why is it that Hispanic voters or conservative Black voters or conservative Hispanic voters vote for Democrats? And I think the answer is that there are these peer effects. If every single person you go to church with is a Democrat and your pastor is telling you to be a Democrat and all of your friends are Democrats, even if you're relatively conservative, that will push things. And the mirror image of this is like in Mississippi. There are places in Mississippi where we get 4% of the white vote, and that's because of socialization and institutions and peer effects and all these other things. And so I think that if you can break those things down, and I think that, with Black voters, there was like a 2 to 3% decline, not nearly as large as Hispanics. But, when we there are a lot of trends in the Black community. People are getting less religious. Intermarriage is going up. If you just look at how white are the census tracts that Black people are living in, that is that is also changing.
Integration is happening at the neighborhood level.
Yeah, integration.
I've seen lots of evidence of that.
Yeah, and this means that like a lot of these, social institutions that were previously, bulwarks of the Democratic Party, in the same way that the evangelical church is for Southern white people, they're starting to lose their power, and I do think that. You talked about racism, and I think that a big reason why Republicans have done so bad among these groups is that a lot of their messaging has triggered group identity among non-white voters. But it is a little
which
more.
Really just means like, if you're a Black conservative, you look at the Republican Party and you're like, hell no, I'm not voting for that, even though no matter how suspicious I am of like changing gender roles or something, I'm not going to vote for, a party that wants to lock me up or kill me. Like,
Right.
why would
No,
I
I mean,
do that?
right.
Like I can feel that, myself, there definitely is a slight strain I feel there is a slight strain of anti-Semitism among some segments of the left that might otherwise appeal to me. So I mean, they talk about this with Corbyn in Britain, and I don't know so much about that, but I see some lefty accounts on Twitter say some anti-Semitic stuff, and I'm like, you know what? Even if I sort of like agree with your ideology or positions on things, like I wouldn't support you because there's this sense of like you're against me because of who I am. And I think that that's much stronger effect for racial minorities in America, because you look at the Republicans and you're like, how can I vote for these guys?
Right.
Like,
And yeah, and I think that just kind of shows, the returns to actually trying to talk to these people. In fact, the Republican Party has actually made a big effort, to try to hire Black staffers or Hispanic staffers to do outreach and to try to kind of lower this, in-group, out-group penalty. But I'll just move on a little bit to some of the why. And it's a hard, it's a hard question. There are a lot of theories that people have. Whether it was about defunding the police or whether it was about socialism, and something that we or whatever, or maybe it was just because of the economy. And so something that we did was we asked basically a battery of issue beliefs, and we just kind of saw which ones were most correlated with switching from Clinton to Trump. And two big strains. First, I think when you look at this big difference between Hispanics from Colombia and Latin America, Colombia and Venezuela versus the rest, I think there's honestly, it seems straightforward that like the increase in socialism branding.
Was it like a Maduro sort of thing, related to the Venezuela issue?
I mean, I think that I think that when it comes to Latin Americans specifically, there's been in the last 2 years a really big change in the prominence of socialism within the Democratic Party. The rise of AOC, and I think that has had some negative branding effects, among this group, because socialism means something very different, to people who are from Colombia, where they had to deal with FARC revolutionaries, or from people people who are coming in from Venezuela. But actually, the biggest predictor, just like looking at a battery of questions, was attitudes about crime and attitudes about the police. And this is something like
because that must have how recently did that become a big deal? Was that not until the summer and the protest that became a big deal?
Yeah. And it's hard
Hmm.
to know since, you can't, it's hard to trust polling, but there was evidence in the
Hmm.
polling that and Matthew Iglesias wrote a piece about this in the summer, that polling among Hispanic voters really started to decline substantially in the summer. And, growing up in Miami, looking at my Facebook feed, I think it really uh, definitely was something that was talked about. I saw a lot of it.
Hmm.
And it's something that showed up, in our polling, that a lot of, when you look at like was most salient, I think that Hispanic voters actually have like pretty conservative views on law and order. I think that in some ways they're roughly as conservative as white people, which when you adjust for partisanship is actually like a pretty big gap. And so I think we're still untangling it. There are other
Hmm.
ways to look at it, but I think that if I had to put two culprits, I'd say it was, the two big culprits. I'd say it's probably socialism and defund. But then what I'd say is just kind of bigger picture, because you can always drill into individual issues. I think bigger picture, the issue in politics, there's been this big fight over the last 4 years of should you go after college educated white people or should you try to chase working class white people, and people usually kind of posit this false trade-off, where if you try to appeal to working class white people, then you'll turn off racial minorities. And something we've really
Hmm.
seen in a lot of our testing is that, first, working class white people and working class non-white people really culturally have a lot in common. And they have more in common than they do with highly educated cosmopolitan white people. And I think that as activists, for a variety of reasons, have successfully been able to change the brand of the Democratic Party, um, to be more in their image, I think that has, that's not just cost us with non-college whites. I think it's also been costing us with non-whites. And defund the police or socialism is like, those are all symptoms of that broader problem where, the only people who like the socialism label are highly educated young people who live in cities, and those are also the only people who are enthusiastic about defunding the police. But because they have this really elevated cultural power, because they literally staff these institutions, these progressive institutions. They're much more represented in the media. They're much more socially proximate to people in the media. They were able to elevate these like relatively fringe ideas to a national scale and
Hmm.
associate them with the Democratic Party brand. And that's had a lot of negative electoral effects that I think in this case were really attenuated with Hispanic voters, one, for reasons of history, but two, because there was this big divide. There were all like most conservative white people already vote for Republicans, but a lot of conservative Hispanics didn't. And this was something that, really,
Got it. All right.
yeah.
Well, that brings me to one question that I've been wanting to ask for a while, and this is as good an opportunity as any. Um, Put you on the spot. Three uh, three issues or points that Democrats should try to emphasize, and three issues or points that Republicans should try to emphasize. Maybe we shouldn't. Let's not do the Republicans. We don't want to give them ideas. Three
Yeah.
issues or points that Democrats should try to emphasize to win.
Well, yeah. I mean, something I like to say is, oh, sorry about that. When people talk about politics, I think something that people like to say about Democrats is, oh, Democrats, we're eggheads. We talk too much about issues and we don't talk enough about our values. And I think that's actually really bad. That's backward. Our values are weird and alien to swing voters, but people agree with us on a lot of different issues. And so I think bigger picture, among Democrats have a wide variety of highly popular policies. It's stuff like making healthcare more affordable, making it easier to go to college, giving people jobs, and that are all popular. And if we talk in general, winning elections, this is an underrated thing, is about talking about popular things and not talking about unpopular things, and using arguments that people find compelling and using messengers that people find compelling. And so when we've gone through and tested a bunch of policies, I think that there's kind of two big themes. The first is that economic issues, almost across the board, do a lot better than so-called social issues or cosmopolitan loaded issues, because
Mm.
people, swing voters, particularly non-college educated whites, really agree with us that expanding access to healthcare is a good idea, that making it easier to go to college is a good idea, that giving people jobs is a good idea. These are all broadly popular things. And I think that's really raising the minimum wage. This is all really reflected in how popular Biden's recovery plan has been so far. The other piece, I would say, is just thematically. The median voter is about 50 years old in a general election, and has a mortgage, and frankly doesn't have a ton of appetite for radical policy change. Something I like to say is that Vermont has a Republican governor and Kansas has a Democratic one. And the reason that happened is that they both had, relatively ideologically extreme governors who went through and tried to push forward radical policy change, and voters didn't like it and voted them out, despite these being very, very red and very blue states. And I personally want radical policy change. But that means that if you want voters to listen to you, you really have to try to frame what you're doing as a common sense, reasonable, non-radical thing that will help some people on the margins. And that's not how activists talk about things. That's not how we have I think one of my friends calls it acid coding. In order to get attention, we like to frame things in the most, radical or uncharitable way possible. And that really turns people off. So I think the two things I would really focus on are one, broadly popular economic policies that people care about, and then talking about them in that way as reasonable, common sense reforms that aren't going to rock the boat.
Got it. All right. So I have a few more questions. One is immigration, which is an issue I care about a lot. I'm very pro-immigration, as everyone knows.
Right.
So since before Trump came to office, pro-immigration sentiment has been trending up in the polls.
Right.
And now, for a long time, and the peak of anti-immigration sentiment was actually when immigration was the largest, so in the 90s.
Right.
But then recently, pro-immigration sentiment saying we should increase immigration has overtaken anti-immigration sentiment of let's decrease it, with still some people who say let's keep it the same. I'm not sure whether the people who say let's keep it the same are talking about absolute numbers or rates of inflow, because that really matters a lot. But the question is, should I believe this? Should I look at these polls and say, look, America is becoming more pro-immigration, xenophobes, you lose. Bye. We're going to, open the gates again and recruit a bunch of immigrants. And you know what? You can just kiss our butt because that's what the people want. Or should I say, are people really saying what they really want, or was it just a reaction to Trump, or did they really know what they're talking about? Blah, blah, blah. What should I think about this?
It's a great question. I do want to really I think there's a big distinction between, what you do and what you talk about. That I think is really important here. When you talk about immigration reform, it's a big humanitarian crisis. And I think that it's worth resolving, regardless of whether it's what you campaign on. But I think the important thing to know about immigration as an issue is that it is the traditional cosmopolitan loaded issue. Really, in every country in the world, and really going back far in time, college educated voters are substantially more liberal on immigration than non-college educated voters. And this is true in Europe, it's true in South Africa, it's true in polling about taking in Jewish refugees in the 40s. I think there's probably relatively deep psychometric reasons, for why that is. And so with immigration, historically it was very unpopular, as we talked about, and it's gradually over the last 30 years gotten more popular. I think as there's been a pretty large and underappreciated increase in the share of the electorate that is college educated. And so immigration is more popular than it's ever been. And I think that after 2016, there was this kind of thermostatic reaction to Trump, where suddenly previously you had a bunch of Democrats who were relatively conservative on immigration. One of my favorite statistics is that if you go back to 2005, Democrats actually had the same attitudes on immigration as Republicans. It was totally unpolarized.
Non-polarized.
So unpolarized. Yeah, totally unpolarized.
Unpolarized, yeah. It was nobody was really thinking about it in terms of something we should care about.
And also, it was just something that, there were pro-immigration and anti-immigration people on both the left and the right. People talk about Barbara. Yeah, people talk about Barbara Lee all the time on Twitter, for example.
I don't know who Barbara Lee is.
Oh, she was a African American congresswoman in California who was against immigration in the 90s on like wage.
Oh yes, no, okay, I remember that.
Yeah, yeah. The most annoying people on Twitter will always tell you about that.
They are annoying.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so this means that even though, now we're at a point where I think increasing immigration is roughly even, with decreasing immigration. And so it's a 50-50 issue. The problem with this is that non-college educated whites are substantially more conservative on this issue than the overall electorate. And non-college educated whites are, unfortunately, due to our horrible racist electoral system, overrepresented. They're overrepresented in the electoral college. They're overrepresented substantially more in the Senate than they are. Like the bias of the Senate is roughly twice the size of the electoral college. And so that means that 50% isn't enough. We need things to go higher. But that, what I'd say is that just means that it isn't something you should talk about. I think one of the really underappreciated things about policy is that a lot of policy progress happens by not activating the other side. One example is in December, in the omnibus bill, we passed a bunch of climate legislation because while Sunrise was out doing a bunch of stuff, quietly, there have been some groups that have been doing a lot to try to get conservatives to care more about climate. And so I think there's a lot of room, potentially.
Is Sunrise just bad for the electoral politics of climate change?
Not my.
Are they just not helping? Because a lot of people say that, but I don't know.
I'm agnostic. I think that, but my general inclination is that the purpose of public-facing communication should be to persuade people, and I think that there is value to moving the Overton window. But I think that really, there's so many popular things. You should move the Overton window on popular things. Like I think the biggest opportunity for activists is that there's a mismatch between on a lot of issues. There's a mismatch between what the public wants to do and what the political elites think is feasible. One of my favorite examples here is, $15 minimum wage is a good example. I think we successfully made a lot of progress there. But one example I turn to is a job guarantee. Job guarantee is something that's actually polls pretty well, but it's something that isn't really super popular among the wonk class for a variety of technical reasons. And you could argue one way or the other. But an activist can expand the Overton window by heightening the contradictions of that mismatch.
Heightening the contradictions.
Yeah. And I think that's
you really were a Marxist.
Yeah. No, it's we all taken our journeys. But yeah, no, and I think that's a more productive avenue. In general, you should talk about I think that anyone. I'll get in trouble, but I think defunding the police, only 20% of the public supports it. And I think that generally speaking, any group that's trying to do electoral advocacy probably should avoid talking about things that are at 20%. But there's.
I was so wrong about that because, I always thought that defund the police was one of those things that could mean different things to different people in a positive way, such that activists could interpret it as radical defunding, while moderates could interpret it as divert police budgets to some other thing we'd rather spend money on. I don't think it turned out that way. People seem to paste all their fears onto that slogan.
People are legitimately, the police are a pretty popular institution, even among African Americans. I think in our polling, something like 60 or 70% of African Americans have a favorable view of their local police department.
Really?
Even if they support other common sense reforms, or even if they're much more likely to say that the police can be racist in various ways. The police are a very well-respected institution, and going up against them directly, I think that there's a lot of support for various kinds of police reform. But when, we see this in our messaging, that when you're arguing for police reform, if you say things like, we need common sense solutions like body cameras and banning chokeholds, that makes people more likely to support it. And if you say something like, we need to rein in a out of control militarized police force that's terrorizing African Americans, that makes people way less likely to support it. And so, it's a real, if you say, oh man, I don't want there to be, defund the police or abolish the police, people will be like, oh man, I don't want there to be fewer police. Actually, in polling, Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders both won elections on the basis of campaigning for more cops. Bernie Sanders won a very close election in Burlington mayor due to an enthusiastic endorsement from the police union there. which is like a funny
You
piece of
don't say.
history.
You don't say.
And he did come out against defunding the police. But we were we were talking about something right before. What was that?
Oh, about police. Well,
Before about you were asking about Sunrise, or right before that?
oh no. Well, I'd asked about immigration. Is that
Okay.
idea real? Do people really care? Um, is
And
that a
I think
winning like social issue for? Because I feel like at some point, um, gay marriage went from being a losing social issue that Democrats shouldn't talk about because it'll lose you elections to becoming a winning social issue that Democrats should always talk about because now everyone sort of realizes that gay people ought to be married. And that shift
right,
happened probably sometime in the mid 2000s. And
right.
so so a couple questions. Number one is, did talking about it when it was unpopular make it popular and change the valence of it? In other words, did Democrats just stick to their guns, even though it was unpopular, and sort of turned off the conservatives in the rural areas or whatnot? They were just like, look, gay people should get married. That's what I believe in. And then people just sort of were like, okay. And then the country changed. Like, did that happen? And like, also, is immigration to the point where, given these poll movements, where Democrats can start proudly supporting it instead of like quietly, technocratically supporting it?
These are great questions. And I think, with gay marriage, I think people really underestimate, well, not underestimate, but they misunderstand the nature of what happened with gay marriage from a public opinion standpoint. And so it's really interesting if you look at the polling about gay marriage, going back a long time, attitudes on gay marriage were pretty flat, and then had this inflection point in about 1994, and then just linearly started increasing. Attitudes toward the acceptability of homosexuality, attitudes toward gay marriage, just kind of had this linear increase starting in 1994, and it's been kind of increasing at a steady clip since then, and now it's very popular. And so the question is like, there was only one disruption, from this linear trend on gay marriage, and that was in 2003/2004, when there was this flare up, around gay marriage in San Francisco. And so what you could see if you look at the graph is, gay marriage gets steadily more popular, and then suddenly dips, over the course of 2003 and the 2004 cycle, because it became super partisan, and then like kind of recovered back to this linear trend. And so I think there's a real point here, which is that I think that a lot of activists have this view that you should get Democratic politicians to embrace your thing in order to boost support. And I think that in the short term, it works in some ways, in that, with abolish ICE or defund the police, initially, most Democrats don't support it, and you get a bunch of Democrats to say it, and then there's, in politics, we call this in political science, you call it follow the leader effects. You can get highly committed Democrats to take their views from Democratic politicians. But the problem is that swing voters don't take their cues from politicians. I think one way to describe it is that hard partisans kind of pick their issues based on the party, and swing voters actually, to an extent that's underappreciated, pick parties based on the issues, based on issues. And so when you embrace, an unpopular thing, that gets people on your base to agree with you. They'll watch Barack Obama embrace gay marriage, and then suddenly they'll support it more. But you'll turn off some people in the center and just lose votes. And in order for an issue to get popular enough, like, you don't want something to go from 8% to 30%. You want it to go from 30% to 70%. And then it's not even an issue anymore. And you've
But
achieved
those are
cultural
two
damage.
fundamentally different things, you're saying.
They are two
Because
fundamentally
one
different
on
things.
one, you just have to convince the partisans who are just listening to the leader, and in the
Right.
other, you have to convince the people who really make up their minds, who don't really know what to think, and so you have to persuade them more.
Right. And so then this
That makes
gets to
sense.
this question of what happened in 1994. Why did this trend start? And I think that
I
there are
think I
some
went to
broader
junior
factors.
high.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, I was in preschool, but
there you go.
yeah, no, so, and obviously, with this, I think there's these broader trends. The country gets more
Mm.
secular. The country um, uh, gets more educated. Maybe you could argue maybe these trends didn't surface in the 80s because of the HIV epidemic. But I do think
Mm.
there's been some really interesting research on gay marriage and attitudes toward homosexuality, in that views were really mediated by the media. Something that happened in 1994 was that the AP created their first syndicated, gay issues column, or LGBT issues column. And
Hmm.
then suddenly millions of people across the country, because people actually read newspapers back then, were actually reading about gay people and their lives.
Right.
And, from there,
Demystifying gay people.
right. No, and this is, since then, there's really, like, I think the reason of why people have changed their mind on this issue is that they've been absorbing information from the media, whether it's stuff like that or whether it's watching Modern Family or whatever. I think that there's, like, the median American, watches, or the median voter watches about 5 hours of TV a day. And so if
Or
you look at
has
the
the
real number,
TV on for 5 hours. I don't think people are watching it for most of that
no,
time. I think they're cooking.
no, no, well,
I
they're
think
on
they're I think they're doing
with Neil.
sit-ups.
So with Nielsen, you have to click something every 15 minutes, and so people. I mean, maybe they're doing sit-ups, but like people consume an enormous, like in terms of TV ratings. Measurement is hard, but like the median voter is watching like 5 hours of TV a day, and that's really where people are consuming most of their information.
I
And so
watch
if you
two
want
hours
to,
of TV a week and I'm like, oh my God, I've become such a TV bum. What have I
I know
become? And yet people are out there
there.
5 hours a day.
It's crazy. It's very correlated both with education and with age. But median
Wow.
voter is old and doesn't have a college degree. So I think people really underestimate. People consume a lot of television. And so if you want to change people's attitudes, they don't trust politicians very much. But if you can kind of put your cultural propaganda, into the media that they consume, that's going to have a long-term effect. And just in terms of like what kind of messages work, I think, there's some really fascinating research that's been done in terms of like how do you get people to change their minds on things like gay rights or even things like immigration. And it really comes, I think the phrase is using addition instead of subtraction. Painting sympathetic pictures of people as human beings, telling stories, has does a much better job at persuading people than citing facts or attacking people as racist or callous. And so I think, with gay marriage, the real victory, and this is probably true with immigration too, was that, the media just really changed how they talked about things in an apolitical context. And then once public support reached 55%, then Democrats just did it, or the courts intervened. And so I think that activists, when it comes to these, making your unpopular things popular, which I agree is important. There's a lot of very important things we should do that are unpopular. You have to win a cultural war of ideas. But I think that you need to do that divorced from electoral politics, because
Okay. Hmm.
in elect like
That's a
politics,
useful, just for
yeah,
the audience, that's a useful thing to reiterate. To win on culture wars, you have to divorce it from electoral politics.
right.
That is
Um,
really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, because basically, the problem is in order for you to win, swing voters have to learn to agree with you. And swing voters don't trust politicians. And in fact,
Hmm.
thermostatic public opinion, it's a horribly named, but in political science, one of the most robust findings about American politics is that when a US president advocates for an issue, it gets substantially less popular. And this is the opposite of how activists think politics works. Like when Barack Obama pushed
How
universal
about the
health care,
space program? I feel like people liked that.
I think it might have. I mean, I think it might have pulled. It's a good question. I think honestly, support for the space program might have been relatively low in the '70s, which was why I got cut. But I'm not an expert
Okay.
there. But what I'll say about like universal healthcare, big example. Obama spent coming into the Obama administration. Large majorities of people supported universal health, the government, providing healthcare to people. And then over the course in the first 2 or 3 years of the administration, suddenly it declined by like 10 points. And suddenly the conservative view on the Gallup question became more popular.
I see.
Like
This reaction
people,
effect.
yeah, no, there's
It
a negative
activates
react.
the partisan. Okay, I
Yeah.
got that. All right. Well,
Cool.
we've gone on a while. I have one big question left that I want to ask you.
Okay.
Actually, I
Big
have a whole
question.
bunch of questions left that I want to ask you, but we'll have to do interview round two, you know, and let's see how people receive this one.
Okay.
Okay, so the the big question on everybody's mind now is I think we had sort of a coup attempt. Um, I think at this point people have realized that with the possible exception of Trump himself, in general, the crazy is not coming from the Republican leaders. It is coming from Republican base voters. I don't know, somewhere around between 40 and 60% of the Republican Party just absolutely views Democrats as illegitimate, is sort of in this quasi-Civil War mind frame, and just will support, essentially push their politicians toward any level of extremism that the politicians are willing to do. Um, though they will not generally like grab their AR-15s and go start a civil war in the streets, except for that one kid. They want their politicians to be as extreme as possible, to reject elections, to deny the legitimacy of elections, to possibly stage coups like this, like the one we saw. So in other words, we're dealing with not with elite villainy or insanity so much as mass insanity of a block of the Republican Party. What do we do?
Yeah, it's really concerning. It's very bad. Um, I think the there was a great poll that I think Elliot Morris came out with today, which showed that the partisan gaps on whether or not Trump should be impeached or whether or not the election
I
would be
saw.
legitimate are much, much larger than issues like healthcare or other things. And hold on, my headphones died, but hopefully you can still hear me. I think that this gets to like, why is this education polarization happening, and why is it that we see all of these this polarization on Trump specifically? And I think that there's this demand side factor, that the country is much more educated than it used to be. Like in the 1940s, something like 4% of voters had a college degree, and now that number is close to 40. And there are these giant cultural divides between college educated voters and non-college educated voters. And I think that that's become that cultural distance and segregation and resentment has become kind of sublimated under Trump into partisan politics. And I think the way that, in terms of the mainstream levers that we have, and I'll talk about crazier things at the end, everything we can do to make politics a question about should taxes be higher or lower, or should healthcare be easier to get or harder, is gonna decrease the temperature and make partisan politics like more boring. And everything we do on the opposite end of making politics about Trump, about terrible things that Trump has said or did, or about these kind of the kind of issues that Trump talked about, whether it was racist things or immigration or incendiary issues, that's going to make politics healthier. And I think the media has a really big responsibility here, where if the media makes all of their news reporting and makes the brand of politics, these boring technocratic questions about concrete policy issues, that will induce a political environment that's different than if every single if all television is about Donald Trump and you're a referendum on whether or not you think he's good or bad. And I think the media so far has kind of failed that test. I think that you get more viewers by talking about divisive cultural issues than you do about economic ones. But in order to take down the temperature, I think the media has to change how they report things. They don't have total power. Fox News tried to moderate, and then OAN popped up. But I think that's what you need to do, big picture. And it's going to be very hard because every single country has seen these trends of education polarization, of populism breaking into the media ecosystem, and it really gets to. And the reason for that is that we really have this real unparalleled social divide, or I don't know, there's been a lot of social divides throughout history, but we have this very large social divide, between college educated and non-college educated voters. And they really just fundamentally disagree on a whole host of issues. And the challenge is, how do we paper over those disagreements and not make them salient? And I think the biggest step that we have control over is the media talking about those things less.
Got it. So media needs to talk about bread and butter, economic issues that affect people's daily lives, instead of pumping up culture wars. All right, so what else? What's the extreme stuff we could do? You said at the end, I'll get to the extreme stuff. So what's that?
I mean, the real thing, look, if I had dictatorial control over the Democratic Party, I think we have the legal ability. I think that even though every country has seen these trends, the nature of our two-party system, and not just the two-party system, but the fact that we have, we have Republican primaries and Democratic primaries, really makes it extremely hard for politicians to do the right thing. I think basically every Republican who voted, for impeachment, most of them were retiring, or
Got it, right.
like, I think it's very hard for politicians to do the right thing right now under our current electoral system. And I think something that's really notable is, like Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, they actually just passed the ballot measure this year, and it's going to go into effect. And I think it was a big reason why she was so outspoken, was that, there they have top four plus instant runoff voting. And so basically everyone runs, you take the top four candidates, and you do
Got
it.
it.
And I think we really have to consider, those kind of electoral reforms, and, whether it's,
Who can
opening up.
implement those electoral reforms if we don't, given that we have our current electoral system, chicken and the
No,
egg problem?
it's more tractable than people think. It is like, first, federally, if Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema were on board, you could mandate that all federal elections would have to use certain electoral systems. Congress has actually very broad authority to do this. They banned multi-member districts in the 1960s due to Voting Rights Act concerns. And if tomorrow Congress said, you all need to implement, closed list proportional representation for the House, they could totally do that if there was the political will. And I think, unfortunately, there isn't. I think there isn't the kind of acknowledgement. I think that there's a lot of small c conservatism from congressmen who don't want to shake things up too much. And I think that that's really sad and misguided.
Institutional inertia.
Just because I think that, we have a very real threat, to the country and to democracy at our current moment. And that is the most surefire way to fix it. But there are other things, the outside of Congress you can do. There are a bunch of states that have ballot measures, just like Alaska passed this top four plus IRB. That is something that progressives could go and pass anywhere. Alaska is a very red state, and it's still passed. You could very conceivably pass laws like that in places like Montana, or places like North Dakota or South Dakota. And Democrats don't have a lot of trifectas, but they have some. And so, I think the only surefire solution to this problem is electoral reform. And I think, everyone should really strongly consider it. We have a very small window in the next 2 years to try to fix some of the structural problems in this country. And then after that, it might be a very long time before we have another. So yeah, I don't know. That's the real thing. But in terms of what we can all more easily do, I mean, I'm all for, we should try to pass some ballot measures. But otherwise, and in terms of what we can all control, I mean, I think the media is super important. I think the media doesn't like to acknowledge that, the political science on this is very clear. There's this guy Zoller, who wrote the origins of mass opinion. The media is the political science is very clear that the media has an enormous amount of influence over what people talk about and what issues are important. And I think that the media doesn't like to acknowledge that responsibility, but it's there, and I don't know, they should act more responsibly.
Is that the essence of shore pilling?
Sure, we can go with that.
All right, cool. David Shor, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
It's been super.
All right. Talk to you again.
All right, take care. Thank you so much. Bye.
All right. And